How's it going? I'm Dr. Benjamin Hardy, and in this video, I'm going to share with you 7 simple reasons why you procrastinate. But before I do that, I'm going to share with you a cool picture that explains how motivation works, because until you know how motivation works, you won't understand why you procrastinate. So let me quickly share my screen with you. This is a picture created by the culture design company called Gaping Void. Their work's amazing. So this is the 3 steps of motivation based on expectancy theory, which is one of the core theories of motivation. So in order to be motivated, you need all 3 of these things. First off, you need a compelling goal. You need a compelling outcome that excites you. If you don't have a compelling goal or outcome, you're not gonna be motivated. Next, you need A to B. You need an actual path to creating that outcome. So if this is where you are and this is where your outcome is, if you don't see the path, if you don't know how to get there, you're not gonna be motivated. It's like you may have the goal to be a millionaire, but if you don't know how to get there, then you're gonna not be that motivated. Part of motivation is finding or discovering or creating the pathway between you and that goal. Number 3 is actually having the confidence or the belief that your actions matter and that you actually can go from A to B. You can learn what it takes, and you can find or discover or walk that path, whatever it may be, or you can create better paths along the way. So you need these 3 things in order to have motivation. And with that said, now I'm going to explain why you procrastinate. The number one reason is that you're just not clear on the goal. You don't actually know what you want, and so there's too many competing possibilities. You need to clarify the outcome you want. It needs to be very compelling, very exciting. It needs to be very specific. The more clear you are on the outcome, the less you'll procrastinate because you know what you want. So that takes to number 2. There's not enough incentive. Whatever the outcome is, it may not be exciting enough. And so you don't see the real reason for doing it because you just don't value the outcome enough to take action on it. Number 3, it's possible that there's just not enough consequence for inaction. You don't see the consequences of not actually achieving this goal or not achieving it in a timely manner. For you, your perspective is that it doesn't really matter if you procrastinate. It doesn't matter if you don't achieve that goal. So part of actually removing procrastination is making there be huge consequences for not achieving success on this thing. One way to do that is obviously to have other people involved. When you're in partnerships with people, your behavior matters because not only does you not creating the result impact your future self, but it impacts other people. And so the relationship can kind of be what's called a forcing function, where because you're in a relationship with other people, you feel strongly compelled to take action. You also have to ask yourself, if you don't achieve this result, what is that going to cost your future self? If you don't think that the cost is that high, then you're probably not gonna be that motivated and you're probably gonna procrastinate. So only pursue things where the cost is high for not taking action, where you really value success, and also where the consequences for not moving forward, for not actually doing something today are huge. And part of doing that is actually getting really clear on your future self and really clear on what you want and putting yourself in a position where you have responsibility for your actions. Like if I myself, as one example, I have 5 kids. If I don't actually wake up and work, like there's big consequence for failure. So one of the reasons why you procrastinate is probably because you don't see consequences. And part of not seeing consequences is that you're undervaluing your future self. You're undervaluing that what you do today actually is setting up your future self for either failure or success. And so what you do today actually does matter, and you procrastinating is actually digging somewhat of a pit for your future self. You're not valuing or appreciating what's really going on. Number 4, you're not clear on the path. As I said before, motivation is 3 things. Number 1, you have a goal. Number 2, you have a path to getting there. And number 3, you're building the confidence that you can actually do it by clarifying that path, by finding a better path. And this is actually a huge aspect of motivation, but it's also a huge aspect of hope. So there's a lot of research on hope. And one of the aspects of hope is what's called pathways thinking. And you won't have hope or motivation if you don't see a path to getting what you want. So let's just say you have a goal that you really want, but you don't actually know how to get there. Then you're probably going to procrastinate. And so part of learning and part of growing is actually, first off, finding a path, trying a path, and then fixing the path. There's a lot of research on the difference between high hope people and low hope people. People with high hope, they move forward and they're taking action, and they also adjust their path and find better ways when it's obvious that their former ways weren't producing the results they want. So if you have big goals, take action moving forward towards any path you can find. Research it on Google, ask people for help. Figure out a path towards your goal, start taking action, then as you take action, take stock. And is your current approach actually gonna get you there in the time you want? And if not, you're gonna have to adjust the path. And the more serious and committed you get towards your future, the more you'll find better ways. Sometimes the best ways take a lot more courage. They're not doing things how you used to do it. What got you here won't get you there. So there's always a better path to achieving what you want. And the more committed you become to this goal, the more you'll find a much more effective and powerful path, even though that path will probably take you out of your current comfort zone. That's how you get there faster. And once you clarify that path, you're gonna get more confidence and excited. So you probably procrastinate because you don't see the best path, or you don't even see a path to getting what you want. Number 5, you don't have the next step. So this goes back to path, but sometimes you procrastinate because you haven't set yourself up for the next step. So the author, Ernest Hemingway, what he would often do is when he was writing, at the end of the day, he would actually leave himself, he would finish the day halfway through a sentence. And the reason he did that is because when he woke up the next morning, he wanted to actually have the next step in place. He wanted to know what to do. And that's actually one of the reasons why people fail in the morning, is because they didn't set themselves up for success the night before. They don't know the next step when they first wake up. That's why when you go to bed, you actually want to go to bed with a purpose. That's how you have more peak experiences. But also when you wake up, you want to know what to do next. You don't want to make decisions in your hazy, tired state. And one of the reasons people procrastinate is because they haven't set up that next step so that it's easy when they start the next time. For a long time, I was a very prolific writer. I blogged, and my blogs have been read by literally over 100 million people. But one of the things that helped me write so effectively was that the night before, I just wrote out like a few bullet points of what I would write the next morning. I gave myself the next step so that when I woke up, I actually had something to work with rather than having to start from scratch. So you're probably procrastinating possibly because you don't know the next step and you haven't set yourself up for that next step. Once you actually take that next step, then motivation really starts kicking in and you start to have some momentum. Number 6, you assume your future self will actually have more time. This is one of the major reasons why people procrastinate, is because they don't value their future self's time. It's a lot easier to value your current self's time than your future self's time. The truth though is that your future self's time is actually worth more than your current self's time. That may sound weird and counterintuitive, especially because we live in a world where we always emphasize the present. But the truth is, from like an investing standpoint, $1 now for your current self is probably worth $5 to $10 for your future self. Like when you're really taking into account compound interest and all of those things. And your current self's time is actually probably worth a lot more too. Now, that's not to say that the present doesn't matter. The present matters a lot. But when you procrastinate, you assume that your future self has all the time in the world. And actually, there you're devaluing your future self's time. If you use your time really well now, your future self's time will be worth 5 to 10 times as much in terms of value. It's just like compound interest. $1 for you today is probably worth $5 to your future self if you invested it properly and if it compounded. That's the same way as time. If you invest your time now well, your future self will have more and better time. If you assume that your future self has all the time in the world, so therefore you'll push off the decision to your future self, you're devaluing your future self's time and you're assuming that your future self has more time than they really have. You're also assuming that your future self cares about what you care about. And that's not true. Your future self doesn't care about what you care about. They're worried about their own issues. They're worried about what's important to them. And by pushing things off to your future self, it's what Carol Dweck would call a fixed mindset. Instead of assuming that your future self cares about what you care about, it's important to realize they're in a more evolved place than you because of what you're doing in the present. You're setting them up for success and you're setting them up for being able to focus on better things. Here's the final reason, number 7. You're not the one to do it. So Dan Sullivan is the founder of Strategic Coach. He's probably the best entrepreneurial coach in the world right now. His company is called Strategic Coach, and he has a concept called Who Not How. And this is something he learned from a guy named Dean Jackson, who's also a genius marketer. But Who Not How is an idea that when you procrastinate, it's because you are excited about the future, but you're not the one to do it. You don't want to go through the steps of the path. Maybe, for example, as an example, me filming this video. One of the reasons why I might procrastinate doing this is because I don't like editing. But if you get someone else to do that part of it, that's why it's who, not how. One of the reasons you procrastinate is because there's aspects of the path or aspects of the process that you simply don't want to do and that you shouldn't do. And this is where teamwork comes into play. We as a culture and the traditional education system has kind of failed us. It's taught us that by working in teams and by collaborating, we're cheating. In the public education system, if you try to get help from friends, you're cheating. But in the world of business and in the world of work, that's not how it works. You can get other people to help you with your goals. And there's probably aspects of your goal that you shouldn't do. You should do the few things that really you love to do and that you want to do and that you that you get the most bang for your buck because you've got the skills. But there's aspects of big goals that are outside your skill level or outside your desire. And so you're procrastinating those aspects of the process because there's just too much aspect. And so by getting other people involved, not only do you support them because they want to be involved in your vision, but you also no longer have to procrastinate. You do your part of it, they do their part of it, and things get done a lot faster. And so the faster you can apply who, not how in your life by actually teaming with people, collaborating with people, and honestly hiring people to help you with the parts of the work or the process that you don't want to do, the less you'll procrastinate because you'll focus on the few things you love and you'll let them focus on the things that they love. So those are the 7 reasons, and hopefully that clarifies why you procrastinate. And if you want to increase your motivation, and also if you want to get better results, apply those 7 steps. According to Dan Sullivan, 80% is getting results while 100% is still thinking about it. If you are unwilling to just publish or put your work out there at 80%, then you're never going to actually get anything done. If you're still trying to get perfect, if you're still trying to get it to 100%, you're never going to get there. 80% gets results. 80% means it's done but not perfect. It means that you've put something out there and you're testing it. One of the things that Dan actually talks about, and by the way, Dan is the founder of Strategic Coach, which is the #1 coaching program in the world for entrepreneurs. One of the things he says is you should always actually test your ideas on check writers. But even if you don't have clients that are paying you lots of money and you're testing your new ideas on them, you should be comfortable and willing to test your new ideas on the internet, on the market. This could mean anything. It could mean a product you're selling. It could be an idea you're testing if you're a blogger or a vlogger, if you're throwing out ideas. 80% gets results while 100% is still thinking about it. Let me give an example. This is a book I wrote quite a few, 3 or 4 years ago at this point. And there's a great quote that says that a painting is never finished, it simply ends in an interesting place. A painting is never finished, it simply ends in an interesting place. This book was never finished. It just ended in an interesting place. Done is better than perfect. I got it done, I got it to 80%, and I got it out there. Now, the thing is your future self is going to be a different person than you are now. Your future self is going to see the world differently than you are now. If I was to rewrite this book now, it would be a very different book than what I wrote 3 years ago. But I'm still glad my former self wrote this book. They painted a picture, it was never finished, it ended in an interesting place. So the problem with 100% thinking is that you think that one day you're going to actually get the thing done. Yes, you'll get it done, but it will never be finished. Nothing's ever finished. And so you're better off getting better and better at getting to 80% fast. Get to 80%, get comfortable with 80%, throw it out at 80%, and then from there you can tweak and test it. And the more you put work out there, the more you'll be able to actually get better and better at getting to 80% faster. And the 80% that you create now is fundamentally different from the 80% you used to make. As an example, I've since written multiple other books. Oh, whoops. These 2 books actually came out in 2020. Now, both of them, same as Willpower Doesn't Work, are basically they're paintings that never got finished. They just ended in an interesting place. I could still be writing any and all of those books now, but you have to finish them at some point. The same is true for every video I publish or every article I write. And the same is true of you. I know a lot of people who they procrastinate creating projects, doing anything because they're so busy trying to make it perfect, and they don't realize that 80% gets results, 100% is still thinking about it. And the truth is that your ideas will change and grow over time, but you clog your mind of creative thinking if you're still working on something. As an example, if I was still working on this book, and I was trying to make it perfect, which it will never be perfect, my ideas on this are going to continue to change and evolve. If I had never finished this, I would have never been able to think about the ideas in this book or the ideas in this book. And so by not getting something done, you literally clog your thinking. This is one thing that people don't understand about creativity. It's not a well that you exhaust. It's actually a system that you expand. The more you create, the more you can create because you become more and more confident putting things out there. You get better and better at chiseling, creating, organizing, and ultimately you get better and better at moving things forward. It's exactly the same as love. The more love you give, the more love you have ability to give love. So it's not like you're going to exhaust your well. I know a lot of people, for example, they may be a coach or a consultant, or they may sell online products, online information products. It could be a book. Just as an example, they have all sorts of ideas, but they don't necessarily want to give them all the way up front because they're trying to keep some of the better stuff on some of maybe their high ticket items. What I have found is that the more you give away up front, the higher quality of stuff you'll come up with for your other work. So you're better off just giving it away all up front, giving away all your best information, emptying your well, so to speak, because then you're actually expanding your well and you're getting better and better at creating things. Now, the 80% rule also works in collaboration. Just as an example, a lot of times when it comes to collaboration, you've got to pass your part of the project off to someone. So for example, if I'm writing a book, I need to pass off my part of it to the editor. Well, if I'm still trying to get it perfect and I don't pass off my 80% to the editor, then they're sitting there waiting for me to get it perfect. And here's the thing, if I just got it to 80% and threw it to them really quick, they would be able to give me insights that I could never get on my own trying to perfect it. And so sometimes you need to actually get your idea and either throw it to the next person on the project or throw it out to the audience. And what happens is the audience then gives you feedback, which then gives you insight that you could have never gotten if you were just away in a cave. There's actually a lot of research on this subject. So I believe it's a quote from Harvard Business Review, but they say that the eureka moment or the lone genius idea is a myth. There's no such thing as a lone genius out there creating in a cave. Creativity is a collaborative process. It's you working with other people. It's you bouncing ideas off of different audiences. And so the faster and faster you can just throw your ideas out there, the faster you can throw your work out there, the more comfortable you can get at 80%, the better and better you'll get at actually finishing projects. And that in and of itself is a skill. In fact, Brian Tracy called it eating the frog. Eating the frog means that very successful people, they get better and better at completing projects. You have to build that muscle. So many people, they can start something. They can start a book. They can start training for a marathon. They can start doing this or that. But very few of them get good at finishing. And finishing is a skill you need to develop. And so one of the reasons why you want to get better and better at being okay with 80% is you need to build that muscle of finishing something. Even if it's just finishing a blog post or finishing some small project, finishing the run that you're on, finishing the workout you're on. Again, people can start, but finishing is a muscle you've got to build. And as you get better and better at finishing imperfect things, and then getting better and better at finishing, you'll get better and better at finishing better and better things. So that's the 80% rule. It's essential for anyone who's in the information world. It's essential for anyone who's a creator. It's just getting better at output. There's a lot of research on the idea, for example, the teacher who broke their class, who was a pottery teacher, who broke their class into two different groups. And basically the objective was which group could make the better pot. He asked group A to just make as many pots as possible throughout the semester. And he asked group B to make the absolute perfect pot. And so group A just started making tons of pots. They just made pot after pot after pot, and a lot of them were garbage. But by the end of the semester, they'd made like 50 or 100, hundreds of pots, and they had gotten good at making pretty dang good pots because through the process of creating, ultimately, they got better and better. Whereas the other group, they were trying so hard to make one perfect pot that they couldn't even end up doing it. So group A could consistently make and quickly, and they knew the process because they had finished it over and over again, they could make way better pots, and ultimately they made a way better single pot than the one group because they were fine churning. And so quantity is ultimately the path to quality. And at the end of the day, once you get better and better and more prolific at your craft, you then ultimately can scale it back a little bit and you can take on bigger projects. But often it takes doing a ton of small projects. If you're a writer, that's a bunch of blog posts. You look at the lives of any of the current top writers or authors in the world right now, a lot of it was churning out literally hundreds of blog posts. You look at musicians churning out hundreds of songs. Eventually you can get to a much higher level where you scale back and you start focusing purely on quality and probably on collaboration versus on individual pursuits. You then work on bigger projects, more collaborative projects, but you've built the skill of finishing. You've built the skill of creating. You've built the skill and the comfort level of going 80%, and you know that nothing's ever gonna be finished. And you get quicker and quicker at seeking feedback rather than holding on to your idea. You just openly want feedback. You're especially open to getting feedback from a live audience. It's exactly like professional comedians. Professional comedians, they test hundreds and hundreds of jokes on live audiences. You want to test your ideas on live audiences. Again, Dan Sullivan tests his ideas on paying audiences. He has coaching programs that are $10,000, $25,000, $50,000 a year, and he tests his ideas on check writers because they're the ones who ultimately are more invested. But you can and should test your ideas as fast as possible on audiences because the faster you get that feedback, the faster you can transform the idea. That's another great concept from Dan, is he talks about how his part of the creative process is only 50%. The second 50% is from the feedback of the audience, which then transforms the idea moving forward. That requires a great deal of what psychologists would call psychological flexibility. You've got to be willing to be flexible, not hold on to your ideas not too long, not overly think about and overly, spin your wheels. You quickly get it to an efficient 80%, throw it out to the audience, test it, then keep tweaking it and get better and better at completing and finishing. You then become a lot more flexible. You become a lot more confident in your ability to create. You become more prolific. And here's another final thing. When it comes to creating a lot of things, you can never guess and you can never predict the things that will actually hit. Any person who's ever created a lot of things and then their work actually became successful, they'll tell you the same thing. You can never predict which blog posts are going to go viral. You can never predict which songs are going to go viral. You can never predict which product is going to blow up. But if you're creating, ultimately, you're going to get better and better and better. And it's also a numbers game. You're putting yourself in a position where statistically, it's just something's going to pop, something's going to blow up, and you'll get better and better at measuring and seeing what works. So that's the 80% rule at work. That's the 80% rule of creativity. That's the 80% rule of ultimately getting work done. Perfectionism is toxic and it will make you unhappy. And even if you don't consider yourself a perfectionist, chances are you actually measure yourself against what you believe to be perfection. So this is what Dan Sullivan would call being in the gap. When you're in the gap, you're measuring yourself against what your ideal is. And we do this in a lot of different ways. As an example, when my kids come down to the kitchen table, if it's not what they want, for example, my wife might make chicken casserole, and they're like, we wanted pizza. What they're doing is they're measuring what's on the table against what their ideal of perfection is, which in this case is pizza. Wherever you measure yourself against determines your happiness level, and most people, they measure themselves against their ideal of perfection. This is one of the reasons why social media can be so toxic. Over 90% of people use social media to compare themselves and their lives with other people. And often those comparisons are upward comparisons, meaning you're comparing yourself with people who you perceive to be above you in some way. We have a lot of what are called reference points. A reference point is basically a standard of measurement. When you're going to school, you measure yourself against other people because there's grades. You're tested on math and science and all those things. And so the reference point is given to you by the school system, and you're competing against other students on those reference points. You're measured against other students and you're competing against other students. And so as young children, we're actually taught to measure ourselves based on external reference points, which are given to us by some external authority, in this case the school system, and we're competing against other people on the same reference point. And then when you add social media to the mix, now there's all these other reference points about other people living their lives and all these, Instagram models and etc. All these people, we now have all these ideals of perfection in society, and we're measuring ourselves against these, and as a result, we're in the gap. You're in the gap whenever you measure yourself against an ideal, which is your view of what perfection is or what your view of what it should have been. And what Dan Sullivan has found, him being the co-founder of Strategic Coach being the #1 entrepreneurial coaching company in the world. And by the way, he came up with the gap in the gain concept back in the early 90s. But the gap in the gain is really the idea of either you're measuring yourself against perfection or you're measuring yourself against your own progress. Being in the gain is where you measure yourself against your own progress. And by the way, that is a much healthier, mentally healthy mindset. And I'm going to explain that in a second why. But one of the things that Dan Sullivan found in coaching very high-level entrepreneurs is one of the key aspects of strategic coaches is that every 90 days they all get back together and they report their progress, and also they go through thinking tools to learn and progress and grow. Well, what Dan found is that often these entrepreneurs, it doesn't matter all the things that they accomplished over the previous 90 days, they would often be in the gap because they'd be saying, yeah, these are the things we did over the last 90 days, but we didn't do this, this, and this. We could have been here. We should have been there. And so they were devaluing their own progress because they were measuring it against their ideal or their view of what would have been a perfect 90 days. And you probably do this on a daily basis as well. Think about it like this. What if you have 5 items on your to-do list for today and you only accomplish 4? You might feel like a failure if you're measuring yourself against those 5 because you're measuring yourself against what today would have been or should have been or could have been. So perfectionism is toxic. Being in the gap is toxic. It's toxic for my kids when they get to the table to say, why didn't you make us pizza? Or why couldn't it have been something else? That's toxic. There's actually a great quote from Greg McKeown. He wrote this in his recent book called Effortless. He said, when you focus on what you lack, you lose what you have. Whereas when you focus on what you have, you gain what you lack. That's a beautiful statement. It's a pure truth. If you focus on what you lack, you lose what you have. What happens to my kids when they're measuring the meal in front of them against their ideal of perfection? They lose joy of the moment. They lose gratitude. They lose appreciation. They lose context of what they have. And actually what they have becomes immediately diminished and devalued because it's measured against perfection in their head, which is a huge lack of gratitude. It's a huge view of lack, and it diminishes what you have. And that's what Dan Sullivan was so frustrated about with his entrepreneurs, is that they would make all this progress over the last 90 days, and then they would measure that progress against their view of what perfection would have and should have been over those last 90 days. And so they've just devalued all of their progress, and they've also devalued where they're currently at because they're measuring where they're at against where they believe they should have been if they had been perfect. And that's what people do on a daily basis. They've got 10 items on their to-do list, they hit 3 of them or 4 of them, and then they devalue today. They say, today was a failure because I didn't get that perfect grade. Perfectionism is fundamentally toxic. You're a perfectionist if you measure yourself against your ideals. And by the way, ideals, by definition, are unreachable. They're like a horizon in the desert, as Dan would say. You can never actually reach the horizon. It simply provides illumination for which direction you should go. You can have ideals, but you don't measure yourself against them. So instead of measuring yourself against perfection or against what perfect would have been or could have been or should have been. And by the way, trauma, in large part, and emotional trauma comes because you're measuring what occurred against what should have happened. Let's just say you get in a car accident and lose your legs. That's trauma. But it's only trauma if you measure it against what should have happened, or if you're measuring your life against other people. Why didn't someone else get in a car accident? I'm not telling you to not be devastated by something horrible that happens. We all have horrible experiences that happen. I have horrible experiences that happen to me. But when you're measuring yourself in the gain rather than the gap, when you actually look at this as a gain, and how can you turn this into a gain? Post-traumatic growth occurs when you actually look at an event, you look at an experience, and you find ways to have more meaning and purpose as a result. You know you've experienced post-traumatic growth because, number one, you value the experience. You find value in having gone through that car accident. Yeah, it was terrible, but you can still find value in it. Even in the challenges that came as a result, you can find value in those. You can find learning, growth. And so you know post-traumatic growth has occurred because you find value in the experience, you're grateful for the experience, and you now feel better off in various ways because of the experience. You feel better off. You feel like you've gained through that experience. That's post-traumatic growth. Trauma is when you have an event that occurs, you devalue that experience by saying, why did this happen to me? This shouldn't have happened. This was a worthless experience. So you devalue the experience. You also avoid thinking about it. And you fundamentally feel that you're worse off now because it happened. You've gone backwards, or you're now incapable because the event happened. You're worse off because the event happened. That's trauma. It's all how you contextualize the experience. You contextualize something against perfection, against what could have been, what should have been, which would make you a perfectionist, which is toxic, which creates trauma after trauma after trauma. Even success becomes traumatic, by the way, if you're in the gap. Let me explain. For a long time, I wanted to be an author. Probably in 2009, I decided I wanted to be an author. I was serving a church mission. I came home from that mission, started going to school, got into a PhD program, and eventually I started blogging online and my blog started taking off. This was like by 2015, my blog started taking off. In 2017, I finally get my first major book deal. I get a great book deal. And then I write a book that ends up becoming called Willpower Doesn't Work. It comes out in 2018. By various measures, it's a great success. But I was wanting to hit the New York Times bestseller list. And because that book didn't hit the New York Times bestseller list, I felt like a failure. After achieving a major goal, a major dream, which I'd been going for almost 10 years, and by doing something that, by all accounts, and this is not to measure myself against other people, but less than 1% of writers ever get a book deal, let alone a book deal at the level I got. And I was never measuring my own progress. I was only measuring myself in that moment against what I thought it should have been, which was a New York Times bestseller. I devalued my success. I devalued all that progress over those 9 years. And so I felt like a failure, And it was only because of how I framed it. It was only because of I was measuring it against the ideal rather than measuring against my progress. So that's what Dan Sullivan's Gap and the Gain is all about. And by the way, The Gap and the Gain is a book I wrote with Dan Sullivan, which comes out in October. You can Google it. There's a link down below. Please get that book. It will change your life. So you can either measure yourself against perfection, which makes you a failure no matter what you do. It makes every experience into a failure. It devalues every moment because you're focusing on what you lack. Or you can measure yourself against only one thing: your own progress. That's where, rather than having external reference points, you actually develop an internal reference point. There's a great quote from Ernest Hemingway. He said, "There's nothing noble about being superior to your fellow man. True nobility is about being superior to your former self." That's it. It doesn't matter who you're competing against. The only person you should be better than is your former self. And if you're making progress every day, then you're better than who you were yesterday. And you are better. Even if things didn't go the way you wanted to yesterday, you're still further than you were yesterday. You can get progress out of yesterday, even if it didn't go as planned. You can learn something that taught you something you didn't know yesterday. You can always be further along than your former self. Who are you compared to where you were 3 months ago? Where are you compared to where you were a year ago? I love the quote from Alain de Botton. He said, "If you're not embarrassed by who you were 12 months ago, you didn't learn enough." Now, there's no point in being embarrassed by who you were 12 months ago because your former self was more ignorant than you. Your former self didn't know what you know because you've now gone through experiences, learning, and growth that your former self didn't have. So there's no reason to devalue your former self, but that's the only person you should be measuring yourself against. That's when you have an internal referencing system. And once you start measuring yourself only against yourself, then you can start taking ownership over your own progress rather than putting yourself in the gap continually. Instead, you can be in the gain. And when you're in the gain, you're immediately happy. You're also immediately confident because you're living your own life. You're running your own race. And so that is really a profound mindset. Either you're measuring yourself against perfection or you're measuring yourself against your own progress, not against anyone else's progress. Who cares about anyone else's progress? You can celebrate other people's gains, and I recommend that. Actually, one of the worst things you can do is measure other people against your view of perfection for them. This is what parents do all the time. I actually have 3 kids we adopted from the foster system. We also have 3 other kids. We have 6 kids. They're all amazing. And my oldest son, he's 13. He plays tennis like 4 or 5 times a week. He is amazing. I'm so proud and impressed by him. But a year ago when he first started, I was much more in the gap about him. I would always see where he was missing the shots or see where he wasn't playing up to maybe where I thought he could be playing. And so I would always point out his flaws. And then I started learning about the gap and the gain and about helping him rather than measuring him against my ideals, which, by the way, my ideals change all the time. It doesn't matter how far my son has come over the last several years. I'm always measuring him against where I think he should be. That's toxic. It is fundamentally toxic for a parent, a teacher, a coach to constantly be measuring a child or a student against perfection. Instead, you help them measure themselves against their own progress. And that's actually, once I started learning that and applying it and helping my son measure himself, not against anyone else or not against what he should have done in that match, but against where he was last week or where he was last month. All of a sudden, he started measuring his own progress and starting to see his own progress, and that built his confidence, and it also built his joy in tennis. He was no longer worried about winning or losing. He was worried about learning. And that's actually a key aspect of having a growth mindset. When you have a growth mindset, you're just focused on learning and improving, whereas if you have a fixed mindset, you're focused on proving yourself, proving your worth, proving your value to other people. A fixed mindset is a perfectionistic mindset. It's a flawed mindset. It's a toxic mindset. And once I started helping my son see his own progress and measuring his own progress, rather than measuring himself against my ideals, his own ideals, or against other tennis players, his growth accelerated like crazy. His joy, his confidence accelerated. So those are the 2 ways in which you can measure yourself, against perfection or against your own progress. One is where you're in the gap. It makes you chronically unhappy. One is where you're in the gain, which makes you joyful, confident. It allows you to run your own race, to stop worrying about what other people think about you. I am only measuring my own progress. My progress has nothing to do with you. Your view of my progress has nothing to do with me. You see the world from your own view, and if you're measuring me against yourself, that puts you in the gap. I'm not doing that to you, and I don't really care what your measurement of me is. The only person whose judgment of me and my own progress that matters is me. And the same is true of you. The only person whose judgment of your progress that matters is you. And you get to decide what your progress means. You get to focus on your own progress. And then from there, you can develop intrinsic motivation to set your own meaningful targets without respect or worry about what other people think about those. So that's the gap, that's the gain. It's a Dan Sullivan concept. The book comes out in October. Please get it, please read it, please have your mind changed, please help yourself be in the gain more, and please help other people be in the gain more. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and take some time to measure your own gains. Look at where you were 6 months ago, and just write down a list of all of your progress, all of the positive experiences you've had, all the things you've learned over the last 6 months. You can do it over the last 6 years if you want, over the last 10 years. You can even do it over today. There are 2 ways to measure yourself: against perfection or against your own progress. There's only one person to measure yourself against, and that's your former self, where you were before. That's it. There are 3 fundamental mindsets, which if you apply, you can make extreme progress every 30 days. And also every 30 days, you can have increased freedom, abundance, happiness. So the first one is clarifying your future self and then making power moves aggressively towards your future self. So what the research shows is that most people are not connected to their long-term future self. But once you start connecting with a bigger future self, you want to start making power moves towards that future self. A power move is any intentional, bold, courageous act towards your future self. It's an investment you make in your future self. It doesn't have to be a financial investment. A power move could honestly be you reading a book. That could be a power move. Like if, for example, you want to learn a certain skill, or if you want to get good at something, a power move might be that you read a book. A power move might also be that you actually join a group. For example, recently I joined a very high-level entrepreneurial group, and it was a big investment. It was a power move for me. Another power move could be hiring someone. As an example, you may want to free up some of your time so that you can have more time either recovering, spending time with your family, or more time closer into what Dan Sullivan would call your unique ability. So as another example, I recently actually hired a ghostwriter to help me with my next book. That was a power move toward my future self. Power moves towards your future self often require courage and commitment. You have to commit to a bigger future self, and then you start making courageous power moves towards that future self. Power moves could be things you actually start. Like, for example, you could join a group, you could hire someone. Power moves could also be things you remove from your life. For example, you may leave a group, or you might end a relationship. Anything that's really relevant and intentional and powerful, a really big move towards your future self is massive. So that's mindset number 1, is clarify your bigger term future self and make massive power moves or investments towards that future self. Power move could be things you add or things you create, or they could be things you eliminate massively and that you free yourself up. So for example, me hiring that person to ghostwrite my book, that was a massive power move, because not only does it get me more committed to writing a better book, and now I have new capabilities being this ghostwriter's amazing skills, but also I'm now freed up to focus exclusively on the things I want to, and I've now got another who, applying who not how to helping me. So the second mindset is this one, which is the gap in the gain, applying the gain mindset. And by the way, down below on this page, you can get a free Kindle version of this book. Because all you have to do is click the link, put your email in, and we will immediately send you a code so that you can have the full Kindle version of The Gap and the Gain. It's a brilliant book. In addition to making power moves aggressively towards your future self, you want to actually list those out as gains. So recently I actually was in my journal and I was writing down, because right now it's end of January 2022, I was writing down all of the power moves I've made so far in January of 2022 and all of the gains that I've made. The gain is a really beautiful mindset. If you're in the gap, basically what's happening is that you're always chasing the next thing. You're always measuring yourself against where you ideally would want to be. And this is kind of the pursuit of happiness mindset. People in America think that happiness is something you pursue. And that's such a terrible mindset, because if you're always pursuing something, then that means you never have it. It's actually a scarcity mindset. Rather than thinking you need something or wanting it, you actually shift to knowing it's already yours. But also, rather than pursuing happiness, you just realize that happiness is based on measuring your progress backwards and no longer competing with someone else, no longer worrying about what anyone else is doing. The things you're pursuing, the future self that you're seeking and making power moves towards is unique. No one else has the same goals as you. No one else has the same future as you. Also, no one had the same starting point as you. So at the beginning of January 2022, no one started where you actually are. Technically, no one is competing with you. Competition is completely in your head. What you do as you're making power moves towards your future self is you regularly take time to measure your progress backwards and list specifically what has happened. I've had some absolutely beautiful things happen this month. This month has been gnarly. For me, this month has felt like it's been like 3 months compressed into one. But one of the things I did this month was I finished my book, Be Your Future Self Now, which comes out in July of 2022. So that was a power move. That is a massive investment towards my future self, finishing that book and taking the time to actually work on that, doing the deep work on that. Another thing is I just finished a massive launch of my AMP program. Another thing is I joined a higher level entrepreneurial group, Dan Sullivan's Free Zone Frontier program, which, I've already mentioned. I hired that who to help me with the book. I also spent 3 days at a writing workshop and just got really clear on my future. These are all power moves and investments I've made towards my future self, but they're also gains. I can actually list backwards. Being in the gain means you're measuring yourself backwards. Rather than measuring yourself against where you ideally want to be, instead you measure yourself backwards. And so all I'm doing is listing my gains from January and I'm writing them down. And that's one of the things I heavily invite you to do is at the end of every day, and this is something that Dan and I talk about in the Gap in the Game. At the end of every day, rather than being in your smartphone and scrolling reactively, put your phone on airplane mode and pull out your journal and just write down 3 wins from the day. What are 3 forms of progress you made towards your future self? They could be 3 things you learn. Sometimes you learn things and make progress by failing, failed experiments, or just making mistakes. Any challenge or mistake or obstacle can be transformed into a gain and learning so that you get better in the future. So every day you measure your progress, every week you measure your progress, and every month you can make power moves towards your future self, and then you can measure backwards your current self against your former self, and you can measure all the progress that you made and all of the massive moves you made. It's really amazing. And it's also really helpful as a coach or as a parent or as a teacher to help those you're helping, especially kids, to be in the game. I've noticed as a parent myself, I have 6 kids. It's so easy to go in the gap about your kids or your spouse where you're measuring them against where you ideally want them to be. Instead, you help them measure their progress backwards. You help them measure their gains, especially as they're making increasing power moves towards their future self. As you're exercising more courage and confidence towards your future self, it's really nice to actually list back the tangible gains. And as you're making incredible power moves towards your future self, you will have insane tangible gains. Like I have a list of like 10, 15, 20 things that have already happened this month that are tangible forms of progress towards my future self. And it's so exciting. And so if you're making massive power moves towards your future self, but you're staying in the gap, then it's all for naught because you never feel like you're actually getting there. But if you're always measuring the gain, then you're making power moves, but also you're actually feeling good about those power moves. You're actually feeling in the gain about those power moves. So take the time to actually list the bullets of all of your progress, all of the momentum you're building, all the things you're learning, all of the tangible steps that are showing you that you're becoming your future self. Why measuring your gains backwards is powerful is because it helps not only for your past to become more quantifiable. One of the things that I recognize in people who are not very clear on their future is they're also not clear on their past. You want your past to be quantifiable even today. If you list it out, what are the things that you actually got out of today? What are the things you learned? What are the bullets? What are the specific tangible things that you actually accomplished today or learned today? Then you're actually making your past quantifiable. You're making it measurable. And if you do that for the month, for example, of January 2022, you can list all of the things that actually happened. You can list all of the moves you made forward, all the progress you made, all the things you learned. And now you're making your past quantifiable. You're making it specific. And as you get more and more specific and measurable and quantifiable about your past, it actually enables you to do the same about your future. You get more detailed and measurable about what you're wanting to accomplish. That's actually one of the beautiful things that happens as you apply the gap and the gain. When you're in the gap, you're measuring yourself against arbitrary ideals. You're competing with other people. You're worried about what other people think. You're seeking status. Whereas instead, when you're measuring your own progress, the only thing you measure yourself is against for me, for example, Benjamin Hardy, the only thing I'm measuring myself against is where I was last month or where I was last year or where I was last week. I'm only measuring myself against myself. I'm measuring backwards. And so no one else's opinion of my progress matters. Your opinion of Benjamin Hardy's progress matters way less than Benjamin Hardy's opinion of his own progress. And so if you're in the gap, then you're devaluing your progress because you're measuring it against where you hoped to be or where you wish you were now. If you're in the gain, then you're measuring your own progress. I'm just playing my own game. I'm just measuring the progress of Benjamin Hardy, and you can do that too. So for January of 2022, as an example, you can be making power moves towards your own desired future self, but then you're measuring your progress backward against where you were at the beginning of 2022 and listing all of the ways you've made progress. Progress can be actual things you've accomplished. It could be experiences you've had. It could be things you've learned. It could be books you've read. This video may be a gain for you because now you can actually pull some measurable learning from it. You can say, because I watched that video, here's now how I'm different than I was before I watched that video. So those are the first two, is clarifying your future self and making massive, courageous power moves towards your future self. And then the second mindset is to continuously be in the game where you're measuring your past backwards and becoming very quantifiable and measured in the progress and improvements you're making. And as you do that, not only does your past get better and bigger, but then your future gets bigger. So the third mindset that would help you make bigger and better progress every month is to walk away from competition altogether. I already talked about this a little bit with the gap and the gain mindset. Competition is a scarcity mindset. It's a negative framing, and it's the wrong framing when it comes to human evolution. We often look at Darwin's theory of evolution as purely a competitive model, but at the end of the day, human beings advance through cooperation and through collaboration. Just think about, for example, the house I'm in. This took a lot of cooperation. It took architects, builders, designers, and then me. And so collaboration, think about going to the moon. We had to collaborate and come together. It was, yeah, we were competing to some degree in our mindset with the Russians, but in order for us to actually get to the moon, we had to cooperate and collaborate within. And one of the things that Dan Sullivan talks about in his book, Free Zone Frontier, which I highly recommend. It's a free book. You can actually download it down below. I will put the link to Free Zone Frontier. It's a totally different and better mindset. Once entrepreneurs or high-level achievers stop competing at all. So for me, for example, I'm a writer. I could spend all my time thinking about other writers and be competing against them, or instead I can just focus on people I want to collaborate with. And once you start collaborating and actually start working with people who have a bigger future, you stop worrying about competition altogether. Then you start having a lot more freedom and confidence, and you're no longer worried about what other people are doing. Instead, you're just worried about your own bigger future and helping the right people have bigger and bigger futures. So who are the people you can help have a bigger future, and who are the people you can collaborate with in unique ways to create new and big breakthroughs? Actually, one of the things that Dan talks about in the Free Zone Frontiers, he talks about Apple. Apple stopped competing with Microsoft. And one of the things they started doing is they started collaborating with the music industry. And actually, rather than like worried about making better and better computers, which they still do, they started bringing music to the mainstream, giving you 100 songs in your pocket, making it so that you could download one song at a time rather than having to go and buy a whole CD, which is what you had to do back in the early 2000s. Because Apple was thinking in terms of collaboration with outside entities, rather than competing against Microsoft, they started collaborating with the music industry, totally nonlinear. That opens up what Dan would call a free zone where there's no other competition, because no one else was thinking to do that. And that's actually what I've been able to do with Dan. I'm a writer, but I'm collaborating with this high-level coaching program to create what would be called a blue ocean or a free zone where there's literally no competition, because no one else in my industry or space would be thinking to do that because they're too busy competing. Competition, I love the quote from Peter Thiel. He says, competition is for losers. And actually, if you read the book, it's called Tribal Leadership by Paul Logan, I believe. And actually, I would watch the TED Talk on this about tribal leadership. Paul Logan talks about 5 different stages of what he would call organizational culture. Stage 1 is essentially just where you're actually like a criminal or something like that. But as you get up to stage 2 or 3, stage 3 is purely the competitive model. And stage 3 is where most organizations are in the United States. And these competitive cultures are where, let's just say you're in an organization, everyone's competing within that organization to get up the ladder. And so because all of the mindset is competition within, they're not able to actually focus very well on the actual other competition outside of the organization. Phil Jackson, who was the coach of the Chicago Bulls during the Michael Jordan era and of Kobe Bryant and Shaq during the Lakers era, he actually uses the tribal leadership model to explain his philosophy of coaching. And he talks about how he's had a lot of great teams that got up to what Logan would call stage 4 culture. Stage 4 culture is where there's no more competition within the organization. Actually, there's complete collaboration, there's clear roles, and everyone ends up going towards the same future. And so because they're clear and committed and connected, they can actually focus on external competition. And he said that that's really where the Bulls were for a long time. And there were phases where the Lakers were a stage 4 culture, but there were also phases where the Lakers were a stage 3 culture, where there was so much competition within that they got smashed by the other teams because they were so busy worried about who was the star. Kobe and Shaq were having arguments. They could never get on the same page. And so because they were so busy competing with themselves, the outside teams just dominated them. But there were times when they got clear on their roles and they stopped competing with each other and they were able to actually start becoming a really quality team. And then at that level, they were a stage 4 culture and they absolutely dominated and destroyed the other teams. Well, what Paul Logan talks about is that there actually is a fifth stage. And that fifth stage is where you leave all competition. You reach what he would call a no man's land. And once you're there, you're in complete creative bliss where no one can actually beat you. Phil Jackson said that for a while, the Chicago Bulls did transcend a stage 4 culture and went to stage 5. They were doing things that no one else could do and that no one else will ever be able to replicate. That's actually is what happened to Apple and to any company that goes forth and revolutionizes the world. You're no longer worried about what other people are doing. You're no longer worried about trying to be better than that person because you're now actually just purely in a creative flow. You're purely in an innovative manner of making the future a better place. And you're in a purely creative, collaborative state. And so the more you can walk away from competition and no longer worrying about what other people do, and the more you can start collaborating with other people who you can team with to create a bigger 10x or 100x future, then the more progress you're going to make, and it's going to become easier and easier because rather than you stressing yourself out, instead, your future gets bigger and bigger based on the value you can create for the right types of people and the quality of collaborations you create. So it's a beautiful mindset. These are 3 mindsets that I invite you to apply every month. 1 is clarifying your future self and making power moves towards your future self. Number 2 is measuring your gains backwards, only measuring yourself against where you were before and getting extremely quantifiable about your past. And by the way, just to repeat, down below is a link where you can actually just put in your email and you'll get a code for the free Kindle version of The Gap and the Gain. This is a phenomenal mindset, a complete mindset shift from what many people teach on the topic of becoming happy and confident and successful. We all go through peaks and valleys, and the good things that happen in your life happen because of what you do during your valleys. The bad things that happen in your life happen because of what you do on your peaks. This is according to the book Peaks and Valleys by Spencer Johnson. This is one of the best books I've ever read. I've read probably 1,000 books at this point, studied psychology for over 10 years. This is one of the best books. And in this book, it explains, just as people, we all go through peaks and valleys. And as you go through valleys, challenges, it could be a health problem, it could be you lose your job, it could be random things that happen, it could be mistakes you've made. If you learn from those valleys, and if you take those valleys to ultimately become better, not bitter, you can then create better peaks in the future. COVID-19 is an example. Maybe your business fell apart in COVID-19. Maybe you had to adjust and learn things. If you learn during your valleys, you can create bigger peaks in the future. Only if you take those valleys and become better, not bitter. You've got to see those valleys as this is happening for me, not this is happening to me. This is what Dan Sullivan would call being in the gain rather than the gap. If you're in the gap, then when you're in a valley or when something bad happens to you, you're just resentful. You wish something was different. You're a victim. Whereas if you're in the gain, you take that valley and you learn from it, and ultimately you take what you learn to become better, and ultimately you can create better peaks in the future. Now, when you get on a peak, this is where most people shoot themselves in the foot. When you're on a peak, you can become overconfident. Maybe you've made more money than you've ever made. Maybe you're in a great position and you stop doing those things that ultimately got you out of the valley and onto the peak. You stop doing the basics. You stop reading great books. You stop doing the morning routine. You stop ultimately moving forward in your life. When you're on your peak, it's easy to get indulgent. Actually, Greg McKeown in his book Essentialism, he spent the whole book explaining this idea. He wondered, why don't people who become successful ultimately go on to become very successful? And the reason he found is that once you get successful, first off, you get overly distracted because once you get on a peak, you have way more opportunity. And once all that opportunity comes, it ultimately distracts you from being focused on your work. And so you end up getting distracted, you become overconfident, maybe you invest your money poorly, maybe you start overspending. That's what happens. As people start making more money, their expenses go through the roof. And ultimately, because people are either overconfident, distracted, unclear, or ultimately just make bad decisions, they fall off their peaks and create unnecessary valleys. So part of what this book is about how when you get on your peak, you ultimately don't want to self-sabotage. You want to extend those peaks, not get overconfident or lazy or indulgent on those peaks and create unnecessary valleys. So again, the premise is good things happen in your life because of what you do in your valleys, whereas bad things happen in your life because of what you do on your peaks. And ultimately, you want to go from peak to peak to peak, and that's what brings me to book number 2, The Big Leap. What this book teaches, which is most important, is a concept called the upper limit problem. So Gay Hendricks is a psychologist. He's the one who wrote the book. And the upper limit problem is basically the idea that as people, we all have an emotional baseline, a subconscious baseline. And usually when people start to make progress or improvements in their life, they start to, for example, really improve their relationships, or they start making more money, or they start getting in shape, as you start creating peaks in your life, you subconsciously self-sabotage. You hit the upper limit problem. That's the concept. Once you hit the upper limit problem, as you start making improvements in your life, ultimately what you end up doing to get back to your emotional safety zone, your subconscious baseline, is you subconsciously self-sabotage yourself. That's how you ultimately rob yourself when you're on a peak, when you start making improvements in any area. It could be anywhere where you're making progress and improvements in your life. Ultimately, because you hit this upper limit problem, you end up self-sabotaging yourself and pulling yourself back to your emotional baseline and reverting back to what your comfort zone is. And so you want to ultimately avoid the upper limit problem by going from peak, staying on that peak, staying there and turning that to your new normal, your new identity, and ultimately then using that as the launching pad for going from that peak to bigger peaks. And that's ultimately what takes me to the third book, which is a free ebook download by Dan Sullivan called The 4 C's Formula. Down below, you can download the ebook for free. It's a short little book. But the 4 C's Formula basically walks you through the growth cycle of any endeavor. So the first C is commitment. In order to actually create a new future, you've got to commit to a specific future. There's actually a quote from the book, The 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership, and they say, commitment is a statement of what is. You can know what you're committed to by the results you're getting. And so essentially, commitment is not what you want to have, commitment's what you do have. So wherever you're at in your life right now, that's what you're committed to. And if you want something new, you've got to commit to that new future 100%. Commitment is the starting point of all growth, and commitment is what most people lack. So the first thing you do is ultimately clarify what you want and commit 100% to that. And your future self, whatever it is you want, your future situation, your future scenario, is by virtue above and beyond your current situation. You're committing to something more and better than you currently have. And by committing to that, you now push yourself into the second C, which Dan calls courage. Because you're committing to an outcome or a situation that's above and beyond your current level of capability and confidence. You don't have the capability, the knowledge, the skills, but you're committing to a level. For example, if you want to be a millionaire, if you want to have a certain goal, or if you want an amazing relationship, you're committing to something above and beyond. Your future self is way beyond your current self. And so because of that commitment, that forces you into a state of courage. Courage is going outside your current knowledge, skills, abilities. It's going out of your comfort zone and ultimately going through the learning process. You start failing, you start learning, you start ultimately asking better questions, developing the mental model or the mindsets of this new level, learning the principles of this new level. So commitment leads to courage, and you can actually know how committed you are to something based on how much courage you're exercising. One of the things that I love that Dan says is that courage doesn't feel good. I spent actually a lot of time studying the psychology of courage in my PhD program. From a psychology standpoint, courage is basically the intentional pursuit of a worthwhile goal. You're the one who determines if it's worthwhile. That involves some form of risk. You see it as risk. Courage can be risky. Courage means that it might not work out. Courage means that you could fail. But as you go through that courage cycle, as you're learning, trying, failing at your new goal, ultimately through that process, you start to develop new capability. That's the third C. By learning, by doing something over and over again. Just as an example, when I first started blogging online, it took a lot of courage in the beginning. I committed. When I was a graduate student, I had no writing under my belt. I wanted to become a professional author, and I committed 100% to that. Part of committing, by the way, is investing money into that goal. I bought a domain name. I bought an online course. But another part of it is ultimately taking action. There's a great quote from James Clear in the book Atomic Habits where he talks about how every action you take is a vote for the kind of person you want to become. And so ultimately, as you take action, as you exercise courage, doing things outside your comfort zone, seeking to become your future self, you're ultimately confirming to yourself the type of person you want to become. That's why habits are so powerful. In psychology, they call that self-signaling. Over time, you start to identify with your future self, but also over time through exercising courage and going outside your comfort zone, you actually develop the capabilities of your future self. You develop new capabilities. You learn skills. You learn knowledge. You maybe develop relationships that you didn't have before. You now have new capability because you exercised courage, because you went through that learning cycle. You have new capabilities that you didn't have before. And because of those new capabilities, you now have the fourth C, which is a higher level of confidence. And then confidence ultimately is you on a new peak. You're at that new peak. You have new capability, new confidence, new ability to produce results. And confidence then becomes your new launching point for imagining goals. Imagination is more important than knowledge, as Albert Einstein said. One of the amazing things you want to do is once you're on a peak, you can then actually see peaks beyond. You can see things that you couldn't see in your former valleys. You now know things your former self didn't know. Just like in the case of your future self will know things that you don't know. They'll be able to see things you can't see because they'll be on a peak that's way above where you're standing right now. And so your future self will be able to imagine and pursue goals and meanings that you just currently can't even imagine right now. And so once you go through that 4C cycle, you commit to a specific goal, you then go through the courage cycle of working through the learning process, learning, failing, developing higher level capabilities, maybe relationships, connections, network. Then you have a new level of confidence. So basically you're now on a new peak. And so you have the potential of hitting a new upper limit problem. Once you get to that level, you're now on this new level. You might want to revert back to your former valley because now up at this new level, you're uncomfortable a little bit because this is now new territory for you. Ultimately, you can quickly adapt to it and you can make that your new normal. It's a lot easier to make that your new normal if you've clarified your future self and all along the way through that courage cycle, you've actually just been reinforcing the identity that that's who you are now, that's how you operate. Your identity is the story you tell about yourself. And so it's a lot better just to be clear about your identity from the beginning. Start with your future self, use that as your new story, commit to that. Ultimately invest in that, go through the courage cycle of learning that, and then through your actions and habits, you ingrain that as your new identity. And so it can quickly become your new normal. And so what I love about Dan's 4Cs is actually this model teaches you how to go from peak to peak rather than unnecessarily going from peak back to valley because you sabotage yourself with the upper limit problem. Ultimately, what Dan says is this: courage does not feel good. It doesn't feel good to step outside your comfort zone in the moment, because you're trying new things, you're learning, you're facing emotions, but it's actually a great opportunity to become what psychologists call psychologically flexible. As you're outside your comfort zone, as you're trying new things, as you're facing uncertainty, as you're failing to some degree, you can become more flexible, more adaptive. You can become what's called tolerant of ambiguity. You can become comfortable actually being outside your comfort zone. Even still, it's slightly uncomfortable and it can be challenging going through that learning process. But once you have a higher level of confidence and a higher level of capability, confidence feels great. And that's why people can turn their peaks into valleys, is because they feel good. They're confident in their new position. They feel great about what they've just done. And that's why I love what Dan says. He basically says, don't stay on that peak too long. Go back to committing again, back to another future, and go through the cycle again. The purpose of getting onto the peak, developing all those skills, abilities, is so that you can then envision new and better peaks and then go back to the cycle of committing again to a new future self and then going through the process, the courage process of developing new skills, new capabilities, and then ultimately new confidence. And so if you go from peak to peak to peak, you can keep going. You can be smart on your peaks. You don't have to fail backwards and keep going back and forth. Instead, you can get onto a peak, really be thoughtful, really be wise, learn from it, establish that as the new norm, build new security around it, a new system around it, and then commit to a better future. And you can go from peak to peak to peak. That's why I love these 3 books, Peaks and Valleys. It just explains that we all will go through peaks and valleys. I love the Big Leap because it explains the psychology and the upper limit problem of once you get onto a peak, it's so easy to self-sabotage, to hit that upper limit problem. And a lot of people, they just can't get through that upper limit problem. They keep trying to improve their lives and then they keep reversing and ultimately going back to their comfort zone. And ultimately you want to make the new peak your new comfort zone, your new identity, your new normal. You want to adapt to that, and then you want to go through the 4C cycle. Committing specifically to a clear future self, going through the courage cycle, developing new capability and confidence, and going from peak to peak to peak to peak. And that's how you can ultimately continuously progress in your life. These are 3 amazing books, 3 books to study. I've read each of them multiple times. I think they're absolutely amazing. I highly recommend them. In this video, I'm going to share with you the best example of someone I've seen who's measured their own progress. It's actually James Clear, the author of Atomic Habits. On his blog every year for the last several years, he's created annual reviews, and he's been very explicit about his measurements. Again, if you're not measuring, you can't manage it. And James Clear has become one of the most successful authors over the last 5-10 years. And I'm going to show you his annual review process is one of the most amazing ways that he's been able to measure and track his own progress forward. And I heavily recommend you do this. I'm also going to start really quickly with a story, why you should do this. So one of my friends, Jill, she is a physical therapist at an elementary school for children with challenges like Down syndrome, like disabled kids who have a really hard time learning and stuff like that. Jill works with these kids one-on-one, and they set goals, and it's obviously difficult work. A lot of times they make seemingly no progress. Like, these kids are really hard to make progress on. And recently, Jill was actually looking at one of her annual reviews. Every year, at the end of the year, she writes about the goals that they're setting, the progress. She actually tracks a lot of things throughout the year. But with one of the little girls that she is working with, she took some time to just look back on the progress report from last year, and one of the things that she noticed is that last year at this time, this little girl, they were working on her walking on grass. This little girl couldn't walk on grass or uneven surfaces. It was just too hard for her, too intimidating. And it was powerful for Jill to read that, because that's actually challenges that this little girl and Jill have overcome a long time ago, but Jill had completely forgotten about it. And so by going back and reviewing her progress and reviewing what they were working on last year, she was reminded of what they were actually doing, which it's so easy to forget. It's so easy to forget what you were doing last year, because as people, we're very focused on what's in front of us. We're focused on our future. It's easy to forget or even downplay your own progress. And there's reasons why you should not only record your progress, it helps your memory, but review your progress regularly, because by reviewing your progress, like Jill just did, you're reminded of what you were focused on maybe 1 year ago, 5, 10 years ago. And by seeing the things that you've probably forgotten, you probably forget the things that you were working on 2, 3 years ago. You forget how challenging it was. So the thing about this is that really your memory is always being reconstructed in the present. If you have new experiences, you learn things, you quickly slow boil and adapt to your new views, your new circumstances, and from the present, you view the past. We always reconstruct the past in our memories based on where we're at in the present, and so your memories are actually always changing based on where you're at right now in the present. And so it can be really easy to forget where you actually were. Just as an example, like I was reading one of my old journals when I was writing this book, actually, Willpower Doesn't Work. And I remembered how difficult this was. I actually, according to my actual memory, when I'm not actually reviewing the progress, I actually thought it was easy. But I went back and I was reading some of my old journals and I realized, whoa, it was a lot harder than I remember it being. And so you want to take time to look back, because it does a few things. First off, it builds hope, it builds confidence. It helps you really appreciate where you're at right now. And appreciating where you're at right now is obviously super important for being mindful, happy, joyful. This is just a strategy not only for building your confidence, your hope, but it does bring you happiness. Feeling progress makes you happy. Seeing progress makes you happy. It also builds your confidence. There's a lot of research that shows that your confidence is actually the byproduct of former progress, former success. And so by taking the time to look at your former progress, by taking the time to actually celebrate your wins, your confidence is going to skyrocket. And there's actually a lot of research on this. BJ Fogg talks about the importance of celebration. Taking the time to look back at where you were before, being blown away at the progress you've made and stuff that you've actually forgotten. That gives you celebration, it gives you confidence, it gives you hope. And that's a lot of the things that happened for Jill. When she was looking at this girl's report and seeing and remembering what they were actually working on a year ago and realizing that they are completely past that. They're working on new challenges and remembering, wow, this little girl used to struggle walking on grass. It was just too intimidating for her, and now she can totally do that. That also gave her a lot of pride and made her proud of this little girl and made her love her more, and it gave her motivation to do her work. One of the things you want to do when you're measuring back on your progress, it actually gives you motivation, grit, and resilience. For Jill and for other people, there's actually a lot of research that shows that teachers or therapists that work with high needs kids, they have huge burnout rates and they quit their jobs a lot faster than normal teachers, because it can just feel like really tedious work and it can be demotivating if you're not seeing progress. But Jill, she's incredibly motivated, incredibly passionate about her work because she regularly takes time to reference back on the progress and she regularly sees those wins. She regularly sees progress. This first off allows her to appreciate her little kids more because she can actually see their own progress rather than just measuring them against where she hopes that they are in the future. So taking time to measure your progress is huge for your resilience. It helps you push through. It helps remind you that you can accomplish hard things, because if you're pursuing big goals, and by the way, the research is pretty clear on this, you want to have really high and hard goals. You want to have big goals. You want to be taking on mountains. But as you're climbing those steps, you want to regularly review your progress. This is what Dan Sullivan calls measuring the gain rather than the gap. You're going to want big goals. Big goals are the most motivating goals. But if you're always measuring yourself against some ideal in your future, then you're always going to be depressed. Again, that's what Dan Sullivan calls measuring the gap. You have clear goals, but as you make progress, you measure the gains. That gives you resilience, faith, hope, confidence that you can keep going, and it actually boosts your motivation to keep going. So now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to show you some of James Clear's annual reviews. And my reason for doing this is just to show you how thorough he's been and to provide you an example that you can maybe use for yourself. Maybe you can start reviewing your progress or creating some way of reviewing your progress every week, every month, every year. And then you can review it on a regular basis just to catch back up with your former self and to see how much you've changed. Because the truth is, you're not your former self. You're not the same person you used to be. You're not measuring success the same way. You've defined success differently. You live in a different world than your former self. What's normal for you right now may have been the dreams for your former self. And the same is true of your future self. What's going to be normal for your future self is the dreams of your current self. And you're going to eventually slow boil into that, and then you're going to forget how far you've actually come. So here's James Clear's page of his annual reviews. If you just go to jamesclear.com/annual review, and down below is a link to that. This is how he frames his annual reviews. Each year I write an annual review, which I share publicly. My annual reviews answers these questions. What went well this year? What didn't go so well? What am I working on right now? He actually, for some reason, didn't actually make one for 2020, it looks like. But I'm just going to show you some of these because it's so powerful. So he talks about what went well, writing. After years of inconsistency, this is the year I finally turned it around. I wrote a new article every Monday and Thursday. So this is when he first started blogging. He said, my first article was published in 2012. I'm proud to say that since then I've published 114 articles on my website, and I have 686,000 unique visitors. He's got 40,000 people on his newsletter at this time, and this was back at the end of 2013. He talks about traveling, weightlifting. These are his best lifts. He's got his snatch, his squat, his bench press. And then he talks about what didn't go well. Creating products. He wanted to create products. He wasn't that great at delegating. He wasn't that great at staying in touch with his family. And then he talks about what he's looking forward to. So I'm going to go out now, and I want to just show you some progress he's made. So at the end of 2013, he had 40,000 subscribers. His website had like 600,000 unique visitors. Well, let's go to 2014. Same model. What went well, what didn't go well. He said his writing went really well. He published new articles. His now website has 2.4 million visitors just that 1 year. His email subscribers are now in the hundreds of thousands. So that's pretty powerful. And now he's kind of measuring it even a lot smoother. He published 88 new articles that year. He got 70,000 new email subscribers. His website got that many visitors. Again, I want to tell you, the clarity of his measurement. You cannot improve or manage what you're not measuring. It's obvious that James Clear was measuring how many articles he was writing, how many views those articles got, how many email subscribers he was getting. He was really clear on what he was measuring, and that allowed him to make progress on his goals. So he talked about just his success in his traveling. He measured how many countries he went to, how many states. Again, here is his measurement for how many workouts he had. He worked out 7 times in January. So he was tracking the heck out of the things that mattered to him. So my question for you is, as you're looking at James Clear's annual reviews, first off, what are you measuring? Are you specifically measuring anything towards your future self, towards your goals? And are you taking time regularly to review your measurements and make sure you're actually making the progress you want? If you're not measuring it, you can't manage it. But if you're measuring it, it will improve. And if you're measuring and reporting it, as Pearson's Law says, it will improve exponentially. So now I'm going to pop out here. I'm just going to show you 2015. We're just going to keep cruising through. So what went well this year? He got married. He got a book deal. He said in his 2014 review that one of his goals for 2015 was to turn pro as a writer, which for him meant getting a book deal. So this year he got a book deal. Here's how his writing went that year. He wrote 74 new articles. He got 150,000 new subscribers, which took him up to 200,000. His blog got almost 6 million unique visitors. And so now at that point in time, he had almost 9 million visitors since he launched it. Here's his strength training numbers. Here's his travel numbers. He talks about other things that he learned. He talks about what didn't go well. He talks about things that he was challenged on, the hamster wheel, it looks like. So I'm just going to keep cruising through this because it's very fascinating. So what went well? He started hiring. He got an executive assistant. His business started to grow. He didn't write as many articles, but you can tell his focus was shifting. He was writing that book. So he got 200,000 new subscribers. His subscribers were now up almost to 400,000. Now his website is just getting insane views. And so again, what you measure improves. And so at this point, he was probably focused on writing his book. His travel's killing it. His weightlifting is improving. What didn't go well? He actually talks about the challenge of writing his book. And so it's just really interesting. This is a great model. I'm just going to finish one more time. I'm going to just look at the 2019 review. What went well this year? Book sales. So at that point, his book Atomic Habits actually had come out. He sold over 1.3 million copies in 2019, 12 consecutive months on the New York Times bestseller list. He's got all of these reviews. He's got all of these ratings. He's now speaking all over the world. He's got this new newsletter. He's got this huge audience growth. He wrote 5 articles in 2019. He got almost 400,000 new email subscribers. He's got like 600,000 email subscribers. His blog's been read 50 million times. And then he obviously has his other metrics of what he's going for. And there's some really important things to consider here. Number one, if you're still measuring the same things you were measuring like 5-7 years ago, that may be a question. One of the things I like about James Clear is that his current self is measuring slightly different things. Some of the things, he's still measuring some of the things he was measuring 5 years ago, but now he's measuring book sales, he's measuring speaking gigs, he's measuring things his former self wasn't measuring, and there's levels. There's actually a concept called a maturity model, and a maturity model is how a business knows if it's growing or whatnot, and at the different levels of the maturity model, there's different things you measure. So you may be at a beginner level, but once you get to an intermediate level, you're measuring different things. You're focused on different things. And then once you get to an advanced level, you're measuring even different things. And so I only share this with you because James Clear is an amazing example of someone who's been measuring the gain. He's been measuring his own progress. He's been public about his measurables. He's been specific about what he's been measuring. He's been explicit and public about what he's been measuring, and he's been improving insanely. His growth curve is very powerful, and I think he's really clear on his own maturity model. And so I invite you to take the time to measure your own progress, whether that be in the form of a journal, a log, annual reviews, monthly reviews, and take the time regularly to look back at where you were before. This is, again, what Dan would call measuring the gain. If you do this, you'll have a similar experience to what Jill had. Jill, the person who worked with the challenged youth. You'll have moments where you'll be reminded of what your former self was up to and what your former self was working on, and you'll realize how far you came. There's a lot of research on this subject out of Harvard. Daniel Gilbert has written a lot about the differences between your former and your current self and about how you've grown so much. You don't even realize how much you've grown compared to your former self unless you actually took some notes and look back on where you were actually at. You see the world differently. You are pursuing different things. You're measuring different things. You define success differently. And it's really powerful to look back sometimes and realize how much you've grown as a person. Again, the same is true of your future self. Your future self is going to be measuring things that you're not even currently aware of. Let me give an example. When I was 18 years old, I was playing a lot of World of Warcraft. That's what I was measuring. I was measuring how much progress I was making on my character in World of Warcraft. A couple years ago, I was measuring my own email subscriber growth. I was a writer, I was a blogger on Medium.com, and so I was measuring how many views I got on Medium.com and how many subscribers I was getting. Now I'm measuring how my books sell, and I'm measuring my income and my investments and my family. I'm measuring completely different things that my former self wasn't even aware of. My former self wasn't even aware of a lot of the things now that I'm focused on, I'm measuring, and the same is going to be true of your future self. Right now, you are completely blind and unaware of a lot of the things that are very important to your future self, things that they're going to be measuring, things that they're going to be seeking to improve. And so the more you can visualize your future self and think about what's going to be important to them and what do they want to be visualizing, and then you create a maturity model where you think about how do I get from where I am to where I want to go and what are the different levels between where I'm at and where I want to go, then you can start to plan out a path. And having a path is really important. Research shows that having a path is key for having motivation and having hope. Actually, psychologists call it pathways thinking. You want to have a clear goal or goals, and you want to have a path that's workable, that's adaptive, but that gives you confidence that you're confident can get you there. And that path is the maturity model. It's the maturity model of where you are to where you want to go. And at different stages, there's going to be different things that you're focused on, different things that you're measuring, different things that you're worried about. What got you here won't get you there. James Clear is an amazing example of that. For a long time, at one stage of his maturity model, he was just writing a ton of blog posts. Then he got to a point where writing blog posts wasn't the thing he was focused on that much. Instead, he was writing that book. Then he launched that book, and his goal became to sell a ton of copies of that book and to get speaking gigs and to make tons of money. Now we have no clue what he's measuring because he's not publishing his reviews. But you can see that he was measuring different things, and he was focused on different things along his own maturity model. And then he was publishing it and measuring his progress backwards, and he was sharing it publicly, which is really generous and really powerful of him. So that's my challenge to you, is start reviewing your own progress, start documenting your progress, start measuring your progress, the things that matter to you. Chart out the maturity model of your future self, and then become your future self. Here, you can get access to one of my future self videos. Please like, please subscribe. Have an amazing day. See you.